from the 14th chapter of Matthew, verses 22 through 33. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him on the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land and buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." These are the words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Mary. And Dave would probably have an objection to calling you Mary Stout, but you're Mary Stout to me. He's not here, so I got by with that one. Okay. Well, we won't tell him, even though it's on TV. So we won't tell him. It's hard. You know, you run into that with people you've known all your life as a name, and then they get married and it changed, and you forget sometimes. So anyway, this is a wonderful story, a story of our faith in God, a story about faith in the midst of a blinding storm, when life takes its twists and turns that we didn't see coming, when our pillow is wet with tears because of the pain or life circumstances that you find yourself in. When your heart's so heavy you feel like you can't make it another day. This is when our faith in God is revealed the most. It's when it shines forth the most. Can we overcome our humanness to trust in the divine hand of God to lead us through these trying times, when the winds of controversy are howling around your face and beating you down, when the ground is literally shaking under your feet, when it's time to step out in faith, believing that God is able to deliver you in the time of storm, able to deliver you through some very hurtful times. I'm having a hard time up here. By keeping your eyes, that's better. By keeping your eyes on Jesus through all of that, we can be healed. We can be whole even in the midst of those storms. But the fact is, for most of us, when trouble comes, we have all of our manipulations. We try many ways to try to fix a situation. Instead of letting God have it, we literally exhaust ourselves trying our way until we finally throw up our hands when we realize we're up against a wall and say, "God, I can't do this anymore." And that's when God takes over and does what God does best. He fixes our messes that many times our manipulations have caused. Does anybody relate to that situation? Say yes, preacher. Most of you exactly that. You literally exhaust yourself trying to figure out ways to fix something, and God does it with the stroke of His breath. It's just fixed. That's why I love the old saints so much. The old saints that have been down this road many times, they faced many obstacles along the way. They have such a powerful testimony of God's faithfulness in the midst of troubled times. There are some who say if you have faith, life will be smooth sailing. If you have faith, God will cure your ills and guard you from every danger. If you have enough faith and you stay close to God. But this text is clearly showing that that's not the case. Just before this text, in fact, John the Baptist is beheaded. Jesus fed 5,000 people on the mountainside with a few loaves and a few fishes. Life and death are happening all around this very event this morning. Then he tells his disciples to get in the boat. "I'll come later. I want to be by myself." Get out of my face, in other words. I said that. He didn't say that. Sometimes you have to be alone, right? Sometimes you just want to be by yourself for a few minutes. So Jesus, I want to be by myself. You get in the boat and you go to the other side, and I'm going to be here and pray. And so they all set sail. A few hours later, we see the disciples caught up in the middle of the lake, and the winds are boisterous. The waves are coming. They're having a hard time keeping the boat straight. The waves are rolling. The wind is blinding. I can imagine it's that sideways rain that always creates so much havoc. It takes everything they can do just to keep the boat from sinking. Now remember, why are they put there in the first place? Jesus told them to get in the boat and go to the other side. In other words, they were very much in the will of God. They were doing that which God had called them to do. Jesus told them to do, and when you're following Jesus, that doesn't mean that there won't be storms. That doesn't mean there's not going to be problems. They're doing exactly what Jesus told them to do. And by being obedient to Him, they find themselves in the middle of a storm. Does faith and obedience always mean smooth sailing? Well, apparently not. Sometimes we follow Jesus, and it'll lead you square into the middle, the epicenter of a major storm. Finally, in the wee hours of the morning, before light. So before light means it was dark. So in the darkness, they're in this boat, and all that's going on around them, and Jesus comes walking out on the water in front of them. And the disciples' initial reaction, they were scared, they were terrified, they were fearful. It's a ghost. What's going on? They don't know. They take heart. Jesus said, "Do not be afraid, it is I." For whatever the reason, maybe they needed proof, whatever the reason, we don't know. But Peter blurts out, "Lord, if it's you." Peter was one of those, he was an impetuous guy. He was a guy that shot from the hip. And he just immediately says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come out on the water with you." And I can really imagine, because I've been in that same boat, not exactly literally, but close. And I can imagine Peter regretted that the minute he said that. I can imagine Peter just regretting it. Don't you think? I've regretted a few times over the years when I'll be in a church service and we'll stand and sing with all of the gusto, "Lord, here I am, send me. I'm ready to go, God. I'm ready to do whatever you ask me to do." And then the consequences of that decision begin to play out in my personal life. The sacrifices that entails to follow Jesus wherever He may lead. Sometimes it's a little rocky. Sometimes it's a little shaky and a little scary. Sent into the world to share the gospel, and then begin to tremble at what that means. Jesus answers simply, "Peter, come on." And I'm sure Peter is wondering about what he ought to do at this point. Peter's kind of caught between a do or die situation. He cautiously will put one leg over the boat, and then he puts the other leg on the boat. And then I can imagine him, like, have you ever been skating where you hold on to the rails? and I can imagine he's probably holding on to that boat. His knuckles are probably white, I imagine, by this time. But finally he lets go. And then there he is walking on the water. He's doing that which is possible, that which in God's world all things are possible. Peter's doing the impossible. Contrary to the laws of nature, the impossible is happening right before his eyes because the God of the universe is happening. And then something happens to Peter. It's almost as if he woke up in the middle of all of that. Now some of you have to be a little bit older, but some of you remember Wile E. Coyote. He was the nemesis to the Road Runner. Do y'all remember him? And man, that guy was getting in trouble every day of his life. He was always after the Road Runner, and the Road Runner was always outsmarting him. But I remember the scenes in one of those scenes, saw it several times. He'd be chasing the Road Runner, and he would run out over a cliff. And he's standing with no dirt under him. He's standing in the middle of the air, and then it hits him what's happened. And then he sinks out of sight. He goes all the way down and falls, looks like thousands of feet on the cartoon. He would run over that cliff. And now Peter and Wile E. Coyote, I bet you've never heard that analogy before. Well, here's Peter walking on the water, doing something that it's just ought not happen. Everything is fine, and he takes his eyes off of Jesus. He begins to look around. In other words, like Wile E. he looks around and says, whoa, there's no dirt under my feet. And he realizes he's standing in the middle of the air, and I can imagine Peter standing on water and saying, wow, this is scary. And he starts looking at the waves, he starts looking at the wind, he starts looking at life circumstances, all that's around him, and there he is in the middle of a lake without a life jacket. Although his life jacket is standing right in front of him. Jesus is our life jacket. He's afraid, and instead of faith, he begins to sink like a rock, of which name, that's what he's named after, a rock. Petros, Peter is a rock. And so in desperation, Peter cries out, Lord, save me. We've been there before, haven't we? We've been in that desperate situation where we cry, Lord, save me. I can't do no more. I can't take another step. We've all been there when we're confronted with something that's beyond our strength, something that's beyond our ability, beyond our human capacity to deal with it in any way. And in the midst of his helplessness, in the midst of his powerlessness, we cry out, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches out and grabs hold of Peter, pulls him back up toward himself, toward the boat. Why did you doubt, Peter? Where's your faith? Didn't you believe in me? Suddenly the winds die down, the waves quit rolling, and the disciples are filled with awe and amazement, and they fall on their knees, crying out to God, truly, truly, you are the Son of God. As I hear God speaking to us today, 2017, I believe the Spirit of God is saying to each of us this morning, the human experience is full of adventures, accidents, other experiences that continually remind us over and over again that this world is broken. But a heart tuned into the Spirit of God and totally dependent upon who God is and what God is in our lives, that God is our source of strength, that God is our source of life, God is our source of everything that we need, our source of hope. He sustains us in the midst of the storm. There's so much chaos in our world. There's so much confusion in our communities. And even when we're certain that God is leading, that God is acting according to God's will, don't ever be deceived into thinking that you can go it alone, relying solely on your resources, relying solely upon your abilities. Last Monday, about 4:30 in the afternoon, in all of the midst of this world's confusion, we lost a dear friend in this church. I was at the hospital, and it just happened. All at once, I dealt with all the normal issues of the day and things that seemed important at the time, but as I stand in the hallway holding Bobby Jackson up as they're doing CPR on her husband and they're ready to call it, that they can't do any more, as I stand there, all of those other things, they seemed almost childish. Almost really, this is what life is about. One of our own finished his journey. One of our own finished his journey and walked into the very glory of God right in that very day. I counted Jim Jackson a very dear friend to me in this community. But as Peter was reminded as he began to sink in the waves, we're reminded to keep your eyes upon Jesus. Look full into his wonderful face. So as a congregation of God's people, we're often faced with opportunities to let go and let God's will be done in our midst. Every time we bring a person to the waters of baptism, every time we gather around the table of the Lord, every time we conduct the business of the church to make sure that we're good stewards of God's resources, every time we face a new challenge, every time we face a new opportunity for ministry, every time we gather at a funeral to mark the passing of one of God's saints, we face another temptation to falter. We face another temptation to focus on the storms that rage around us rather than the power of God to comfort us. We focus instead upon Jesus the Lord, the master of the winds, the master of the waves. We do know that Jesus is calling us forth as his people, and God invites us to trust him. I invite you this morning, for whatever your storm is today, to let go and to let God. So we go from here seeking to be God's faithful people, trusting and depending upon God's will and God's way to move us to life, always keeping our eyes focused on the author and the finisher of our salvation, Jesus the Christ. We don't know what we'll face in this world, but be of good courage. God will give us faith to let go of the world. Give us faith to have good courage, not knowing where we're going, but only that God's almighty hand is leading us, the same God that is supporting us and loving us and caring for us and meeting all our needs according to his riches in glory. Let go and let God. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. In the midst of the storm, look full in his wonderful face, and you'll never regret that walk with Jesus Christ.